I feel pretty confident in saying that most of you watching probably have a special corner of your brain reserved for remembering all 1000 plus Pokémon. Some may occasionally slip your mind, sure, but they're all in there somewhere. But does that also apply to the characters of the games? After all, the Pokémon Company tends to draw far less attention to the trainers behind the Pokémon, although that has changed somewhat in recent years, as they've come to realize figures like Cynthia and Ingo and Emmett are more popular than like half of the Pokémon roster. But they can't all be red or blue. Some folks are just destined to be the human equivalent of a Quilladin, where most players have forgotten they've ever encountered them by the time they're inducted into the Hall of Fame. That's the characters I want to look at today, as we pick the most forgettable one in every region. Keep in mind though, in order to qualify, a character must be a part of the story in the sense that you can't normally beat the game without encountering them, and they must be, an actual character. So no Biker Peter or Pokefan Lois. We're gonna start in Kanto, as we always do, which is a surprisingly easy one. Despite this region having easily the most recognizable set of gym leaders through the sheer power of repetition, there are so many games set in this region at this point that we have several characters who only appear in one set, making them quite easy targets for slipping your mind. Primo from Fire Red and Leaf Green is one example. He runs the TGTV, a helpful guide for new players that explains how everything works, and is probably one of the most forgettable Pokemon characters ever. But at the same time, he is not mandatory to be seen, I don't think, so he doesn't qualify. Trace from Let's Go is the most forgettable rival in series history by a landslide, it's not even close, but I would wager most folks that play these games will at least somewhat recognize him purely because he's still, your rival of course. And so, my vote goes to Celio, the Pokemon storage system developer of the Sevii Islands, and therefore exclusive to Fire Red and Leaf Green. Unlike many other storage system developers, not exactly a memorable bunch to begin with by the way, Celio is mandatory to engage with during the Sevii Islands portion of the game, eventually allowing you to trade with Ruby and Sapphire, and giving you a map for the islands. On paper, that means his role is actually bigger than his pal Bill's, but I think it's fair to say Bill leaves a way more memorable impression with his screen time than Celio does. And the fact that Celio never appeared in the anime and barely featured in the manga definitely doesn't help his case either. For Johto, my very first instinct was Yusin, the Suicune hunter that appeared in both Crystal and the Gen 2 remakes, but come to think of it, he's actually fairly memorable and appears in quite a bunch of different material. And so, I had to do some digging to find 3 characters I had genuinely totally forgotten about, which make for a very close tie in this region. Petrol and Proton are 2 Team Rocket executives introduced for Heart Gold and Soul Silver. And while both Archer and Ariana managed to make something of an impression at least, these 2 very much did not. Archer at least reappears in Let's Go, which was actually quite a pleasant surprise, while Ariana has the whole is she Silver's mom thing attached to her, which helps. But Petrol and Proton, nothing really. You fight both of them twice and that's about it. There's nothing remarkable about them beyond that. They're easily the most forgettable evil team admins we've ever had. But someone who I would say is even more forgettable, if you even know she existed in the first place, is DJ Mary. She's a radio host working in the Goldenrod radio tower, and is, ironically enough, a celebrity in both the Johto and Kanto regions. While I don't think she's a mandatory encounter in that role, she does appear at the ending after you've become champion looking for an interview. While I would say the fact she barely appears in her origin games make her an easy winner, the fact is that DJ Mary has actually done well for herself in other material. She appeared in the anime and the manga, has multiple trading cards, and even appears in Pokemon Stadium 2, which might help her case. But I would say the simple fact Proton and Petrol are battleable, as well as featuring in the manga and TCG as well, make DJ Mary the most forgettable character of Johto. When we look at Hoenn, I feel like there are 2 different elephants in the room we must acknowledge. First is One, the Emerald exclusive gym leader that replaced Wallace. He is probably the most forgettable gym leader of all time, but I would still say the simple fact that he is a gym leader does make him more memorable than other candidates. In a similar camp are the Frontier Brains, who I would wager the majority of players never even encountered and don't really have much of a character beyond their set of Pokemon. That That said, both the anime and manga treated them pretty much the same as gym leaders, and since many fans still love the Battle Frontier to this very day, I think the persisting hunt for their symbols is enough to elevate them above this questionable honor. Not to mention, they technically don't appear in the main story of the game, they're more optional super bosses. And so, I think the title goes to another affiliate of the Battle Frontier, its owner in fact, Scott. Yes, he is also prominent in the anime and manga, but in a more supporting role, similar to how he appears in Emerald throughout the story, making him an unmissable encounter. The thing is though, when you're actually at the Battle Frontier, he's just chilling at home and plays virtually no role anymore. And so, he kinda ends up being that random unmemorable dude who randomly bugs you throughout the game for a line or two and then dips again. And don't forget, like the entire Battle Frontier, he doesn't appear in the original Ruby and Sapphire, or Auras for that matter. Even though Sinnoh's Battle Frontier brains are probably even less memorable than Hoenn's, the fact is that they remain optional encounters, with the exception of Palmer, but he is Barry's father, that makes him memorable outright. So instead, I think we must look in the direction of the stat trainers, some of which are very memorable, like Cheryl and Riley, some are kinda memorable, like Marley, and others are outright forgettable, like Myra and Buck. Now, I would say that purely because Buck is Flint's brother, he is slightly more memorable compared to Myra, but you can make the argument Myra is not a mandatory encounter. I think you're very likely to come across her while playing the game, but you don't have to. Buck is technically found in the post-game, but he is part of the natural story progression of the post-game, so I'm just gonna play it safe here and give Buck the title. But if you consider Myra a true part of the main game, she's also a very viable candidate. In Unova, we also have several candidates where we can't avoid diving into technicalities. Take Mr. Metal for example. He's impossible to miss in Black and White 2, he's incredibly forgettable, but he also is not really a character. We know nothing about him, he's basically just a walking notification. There's no personality or character to him whatsoever. Yancy and Curtis are also both from the sequels and quite easy to slip your mind. But not only are they technically missable, even if unlikely, the way their story eventually develops is so unique, even if niche, that I feel like they are at least quite memorable for everyone that has heard of or encountered them. So my vote goes to someone who is without a doubt a forced encounter and still remarkably forgettable, Fannel. She used to run the Dream World, which has now been discontinued for more than 10 years. So every time you currently play the game, you can literally just skip through every word she says and not miss anything of value. Returning to her later is also pointless now, so Fannel and her sister Amanita, who runs the box system of Unova, could have slipped your mind seconds after meeting them and you wouldn't be reminded of them again until this very moment. Interestingly enough, the number of NPCs in Pokémon games was significantly lowered from Black and White to X and Y, and it never really recovered again, although Scarlet and Violet have recently upped the numbers a bit more. But it also makes our job here more difficult, as it's usually those extra unimportant NPCs that end up winning, and Kalos keeps the selection small there. Based purely on the games, you would have to say Alexa and Bonnie are definitely up there, as some of the least memorable faces you'll encounter on your journey, but they both are very prominent in the anime, Bonnie especially, so I think they're safe purely based on that alone. Since I'm hesitant to call Mr. Bonding and Phil the Photo Guy proper characters, let alone mandatory encounters, I'm giving the title for this region to Gherkin, the grandfather of Corinna and Mega Evolution Guru. Now, I honestly think he is still pretty memorable to be honest, arguably the most memorable from every character in the video so far, but compared to the rest of Kalos, he just simply doesn't weigh up. If we had battled him, that might have saved him, but I'm afraid he'll win the questionable honor this time around. For Alola, I was very tempted to call out Annabelle here. Not because she's forgettable here, I think she's very memorable actually, but because I'm not entirely sure everyone realized or remembered this is not a new character. She was already an Emerald as one of the Frontier brains, although her role in Sun and Moon definitely feels like the new standard depiction for her. The anime also plays another big role here, as it was very character focused, which makes our job even more tricky. I was initially inclined to give the title to Ryuki, until I remembered he is actually optional, although I do feel like he is very likely to be encountered in especially the Ultra games. But for the sake of consistency, he is off the table, meaning that Gherkin immediately loses his title of most memorable winner of this video, with Mullane now taking that crown. He is an Elite 4 member, which would usually be enough to save you, but Alola builds up its somewhat small roster of characters so much that it isn't enough. He does appear in the main story though, albeit in a fairly minor role, and out of all Alola characters, he is probably featured in the anime the least, so I would say he makes for a very solid candidate. Galar is in a similar position to Alola, in that its characters are actually very memorable all across the board. Sure, Swordward and Shieldbird absolutely suck, but you can't say they're forgettable for how infamous they are. Since Fossil Reconstructor Karalis is another for the category, likely to be encountered but not mandatory, we have to once again look at characters who are frankly quite prominent, just like with Mullane. This time though, we have the DLC to help us out, where both Honey and Nia from respectively the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra fell to the wayside a bit. They are important parts of their DLC stories, don't get me wrong, but they're not the main focus, and they're also not super memorable in what they do. They're overshadowed quite a bit by Mustard and Peony. Between Honey and Nia, I would say Honey is more prominent in Sword and Shield itself, but Nia gets a big boost due to retroactively becoming Penny's sister, so it's very close all things considered. I would say Nia is ever so slightly more forgettable, but it really is very close, and she's still a pretty memorable character all things considered. It's not like she's a nobody whatsoever. Next, we turn the clock back towards the days of Hisui, where we find a lot more forgettable characters, I would say. Basically every lower ranked member of the Galaxy team could qualify. They don't do much of note, but are unmissable, making them essentially the perfect candidates for this video. While I wouldn't knock anyone for arguing the winner should be Sitsu, Basel, Kolza or Sanqua, those still have an air of being optional to them, even though I don't think all of them technically are. My vote would be Benny, the potato mochi guy, who does appear quite prominently in the story as a boss, suddenly revealing he is an elderly ninja during the climax. While this fight could have made him super memorable, it is heavily overshadowed by what comes later. The legendaries, both regular and origin, Kamado and Volo of course, are all way more memorable bosses, meaning Benny gets kinda swept away during that part of the game. What also doesn't help is that his descendant isn't super clear, which does help for example with someone like Sanqua. It's supposed to be Wally, by the way, but I don't think I realized that while playing the game. And finally we have Scarlet and Violet, where we're combining Paldea, Kitagami and the Blueberry Academy, all three of which do a great job of making their characters memorable, and the open world style of the game also makes it so very few side characters are forced encounters. For example, I was originally inclined to pick the least memorable teacher at the Academy, which I would think is Salvatore, but I'm pretty sure he's completely optional to meet. So instead, the title goes to someone else entirely, who arguably deserves it even more, since he's pretty easy to slip your mind. Harrington. He used to be the director of the Academy before Clavel, and is currently Ortega's piano instructor. You cannot miss encountering him. He's always found at Ortega's base and even a forced battle, but despite him actually playing a pretty major role in the backstory of Team Star, I would say Harrington himself has basically completely left the collective memory of Scarlet and Violet. But hey, that makes him the perfect winner for a video like this. And that's all of them. Which characters do you consider to be the most forgettable? Could you even remember all the names that popped up here? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel to stay updated on all my future Pokemon content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.